parliamentarians, ministers, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. I am extremely happy to meet with all of you today for this new Conference of Ambassadors. This is after 2 years where, because of the health crisis, we have not been able to meet. It was a great pity. Of course, we did meet last year in different ways, but this way of connecting in person, having exchanges with each other is obviously quite different and very precious. And I would like to say, first of all, that I would like to start off by thanking all of you. The very long crisis, the COVID crisis, which has affected all our countries, has also hugely affected your teams, your families, and your households. Some of you had to live and operate in countries which were very badly affected by COVID, and this was during a long period. And with your teams, you had to contribute to fulfill our mission during that period, which was to protect all our French citizens. I would like to thank all of you and your teams for what you have accomplished during that period. You protected our citizens. You actually managed to repatriate and send some home, homeschooling as well for the children, and all the other trials that you had to face during this period. And our diplomatic, consular, cultural and educational services were put to test. I'd also like to thank all of the members of the Crisis Resolution Center, which has carried out its work in an exemplary manner with all of you when you needed it, but also in Afghanistan last year and in Ukraine today. In the last few years, there have been increasing numbers of crises. Some have become even more stringent. But obviously, I'd like to start off by saying that you have stood forth and strong during this period. During the last 5 years, you have fulfilled all your role in defending the interests of our country. Despite unexpected events and different odds, we have taken concrete action. We've also set up true reference points for the collective community. We have reinforced European sovereignty, and I think this is extremely important. In September 2017, I made a speech at the Sorbonne where I talked about the importance of having a stronger, more defendable Europe. And everybody said, we're going back to 1916. What does all of this mean? What do these words mean? Let us go back to defending the principles that we've had up to now. However, we set the framework, and I am delighted to say that this framework has now been shared and spread. All the European countries have adopted it. Germany has adopted it, and I would like to once again mention Chancellor Scholz's speech in Prague a few days ago, which is completely in keeping with this way of looking at things and this way of operating. We've also built a stronger Europe on the defense front, and this was done brick by brick, bilaterally, but also multilaterally. We've had agreements with Greece and Croatia. We've also managed to have unexpected and unbeknownst to until now bilateral agreements with Germany and Italy. And we have managed, therefore, to take action jointly against this crisis. It is Europe that actually produced the vaccines, continue to protect our populations. It was Europe, once again, that enabled strong recovery, which made it possible in starting April 2020 to have an agreement between France and Germany. It also allowed us together, all 27 countries, to invest hugely and also to reconcile any debts and pool our debts by working working together in an unprecedented manner. We have also been extremely efficient and effective in our joint action against Russia. Immediately after Russia's intervention in Ukraine, we had a united and quick and strong response. We have taken historical action by exercising sanctions. But it is not only by responding to these crises that Europe has made progress. I talked about the defense area, where we've made a great deal of progress, but we've also made progress in the area of technology. For example, internet services are being regulated in an unprecedented way, and also we have worked in many other areas. Permanent representation has also boosted inter-ministerial activities. Many of the ministers who are present here were active in many different areas concerning all of this. But despite the war that started on the 24th of February, despite the pandemic which continues to exist, despite the political situation in our country, which I will not go into in any great details, I'd just like to say that the French presidency of the European Union Council was extremely successful. Now, also in the climate area, we have been taking action. Our aim to go fit for 55 has advanced. We have got several texts and laws that have been passed. Also, there's been a directive on minimum wages between Europe. There's also been action taken on the equality of gender equality in wages, and also in other laws which have been blocked up till now, particularly concerning equal salaries, which have now been opened up, and also by taking action against the major IT companies, where we've put an end to some of the biggest dominating all the services, and also, as I said, in defense, by adopting our strategic compass. So we have changed Europe. It is no longer the same as it was 5 years ago. It is more aware, it is more sovereign, it is stronger. And in this way, we have actually made sure that all those scandal mongers who were saying that Brexit was just the beginning of a whole series of other exits from the EU have been proven wrong. And this is something that shows that our democratic model has been upheld. Our multilateralism has also been very efficient. 5 years ago, the United States were a very strong country, which is one of the strongest countries in the world, decided to step out of many of the agreements, such as the Paris Agreement for climate, but also the nuclear proliferation agreements. And therefore, we had to face real risks concerning multilateralism and the risk of it collapsing. This, of course, was something that we had to defend with lucidity, with clear-mindedness. And I think what we have tried to do collectively is to preserve efficient multilateralism by working together with all the different stakeholders, whether they be states or governments, corporations, NGOs, or civil society. And I'd just like to talk about the action that French diplomacy took in the area of the pandemic. We launched, for example, Act A soon after the pandemic began. And with some European partners, we worked with the African countries who'd been hugely affected by the pandemic and were fragile. As a result of that, we worked together with the African Union. We worked on a strategy which was presented in the G20 and which concerned the access to vaccines, developing production capacities, and reinforcing health systems. Ever from 2017 onwards, given the fact that the Americans had withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, we once again got active, and we did what we managed in 2015, where we brought the whole world together and signed the Paris Agreement. We did the same thing. We organized the One Planet Summit. There were many countries that hadn't signed or ratified, and the Americans, as I said, had withdrawn. now the United States have decided to come back. But we've also managed to ratify. And with the One Planet Summit, we once again set up new coalitions, again with governments, companies, NGOs, social and civil societies, and we've worked with startups of different sorts, and we've come up with concrete action for climate and biodiversity. We use the same method for biodiversity, and in January 2021 we launched the same sort of initiative but for biodiversity, and this was alongside with the COP that was which was ongoing in Glasgow. Now, concerning regulations, concerning the internet, we also took certain initiatives. We brought together the diplomatic networks and the large networks, and we came up with a European regulation on IT uses. And subsequently, we launched the Christchurch Appeal. This was shortly after the attacks in New Zealand. And thanks to the Christchurch Appeal, we can better protect ourselves against hate speech and terrorist content online. We also set up the Paris Forum for Peace, and every year there are new projects that are presented, and here once again these projects aim towards having new initiatives and setting up new proposals. We've continued our struggle to fight and eradicate inequalities. We've also set up the Forum Generation Equality. We made great progress concerning the empowerment of women, education of girls, the rights to sexual and reproductive health, fighting violence, and supporting all forms of freedom. We've also worked on protecting fundamental rights. We have done this through the Information and Democracy Partnership, which is extremely active. We have worked hand in hand with many different stakeholders to uphold international justice and fight impunity. We have taken action again, fighting wars of crimes that have been carried out during war action taken by Russia in Ukraine. And we have also taken action in Niger 2 years ago. And we have done what we could to make sure that France continues to be a force for balance. That is, that it would set up new partnerships and do away with the forms of imbalance that saps all our efforts. We have worked with Africa during our multilateral action that I talked about at the G7 in Biarritz, but also elsewhere. We have also worked with other countries to come up with new strategies that correspond to the reality that the world faces. And then our armies, our military forces are there. They are the leading armies, and they are there to prevent forms of escalation and protect our countries. As I said, Africa is really at the heart of our partnership, but we are using a different form of language. As I said at the G7 in Biarritz, Africa was not just the countries that were invited on the last day in the outreach sessions. On the contrary, it was there throughout the G7 and therefore was really very much at the heart of the G7. We have also built this partnership by looking at our past head-on, and we have reconnected with Rwanda, which is a very important partner for all our initiatives. Worldwide, we have taken action to stand up to different forms of crises as permanent members of the Security Council should. And every time we have tried to forestall escalations and find diplomatic solutions to conflicts and to conflict resolution. We have taken steps to stand up for urgent humanitarian action that needs to be taken for civil populations in Ukraine, in Syria, but also in Afghanistan, Lebanon, and in Pakistan. So we have been working closely to make Europe stronger during this period and to protect and save multilateralism. We have also worked towards building new constructions and new strength. I think you should be proud of what we have succeeded in achieving in the last 5 years. Now, obviously, France has not done all of this on its own. It hasn't come up with all these concepts on its own. Obviously, we have pushed for some of these concepts. We have always been the upholders of goodwill, so to speak. And I would just like to say that what we have always tried to do is find the most efficient ways of bringing together and strengthening joint action. And the reason, and what I think is what we have to do all the time is exactly that. It doesn't matter who the source of these good actions may be, but if we can pool our resources and spread these good actions, then I think we will have achieved a great deal. But we must also be proud of what we should do and stand up and be aware of what we stand for. Since 2017, I've wanted to make sure that our international facilities be reinforced, and this is the case. We have done this in many different ways. On the 4th of August 2021, I would just like to say that a special law was passed. We have worked on increasing public aid to development, which will continue. And we want this to enable our diplomacy to have greater flexibility and agility. Well, I would like to say that it has been weakened. We would also like to take action which will enable us to move from a traditional policy of development, which was changing anyway, but which wasn't really immediately obvious to our partners, to a different diplomacy, which would be based on solidarity in our investments and our policies, and which would allow to have a equal footing in our relations, particularly with our colleagues and partners on the African continent. For many years, public aid was reduced, but we're trying to correct that, and also we are bringing in new ideas. Our minister will uphold this, but also other ministers will support this, and the AFD, which is the main agency for development, will play a key role. And here once again, it will be possible for us to take action through the development banks and the regional banks worldwide. And I think this will allow us, therefore, to speak in a new way, but also to reach out to many more people and be more efficient. This is not enough, obviously, and therefore in 2023, for the first time, at least in the last 30 years, the Quai d'Orsay, your administration, will have an increase in the number of new jobs available, and also there will be an increase in its financial needs. So this is the first time in the last 30 years. I know exactly what your expectations are, and I would like to say that I am absolutely convinced that we have to defend your capacities to defend the interests of France. I know as well that some have been uprooted and perhaps dissatisfied with the action that we have taken to adapt our public service, civil service. In fact, our diplomacy is made up of practitioners now who come from many different horizons. And what I would like to say, defending your particular profession doesn't mean that we are giving up on certain basic precepts. Your ministry is extremely important. Your ministry has responsibilities which are huge. And this is why, by opening up to people coming in from other branches and from other ministries, would also be a way of succeeding in our diplomacy, because we will be reaching out and training new talents. Of course, we will continue to have career diplomats, and we will continue to train talents who come into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But we will also use the technical talents and competences that may come from other ministries. And this reform will allow us to be even more agile. During the pandemic, this was extremely important, but also dealing with IT issues, and also the profession of a diplomat now has to go hand in hand with know-how, knowledge in areas such as technology and also epidemiology or health issues. So this is why we must use all the different competences of the diplomatic corps as much as we can, but we have to do this by enriching those who are in our teams. So we have to therefore reinforce our roles and our capacity to act and take action. This is why I would ask all of you to give your support to this reform, which I think is really positive for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And the Ministry of Europe and the Foreign Affairs will become really the leader of all international action. That's what it's all about as well. For decades now, there was a progressive attempt to see that some of the subjects actually went out of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and went to the other ministries where they took on a certain international resonance. But what's going to happen is here the change will enable the Ministry of Foreign Affairs itself to engage with that international resonance on all these different subjects and varied subjects. So I would ask again for your support so that our diplomacy in the days to come and the months to come will be even more agile and open. I have asked our Minister of Foreign Affairs to work closely with you and also with our parliamentarians, and this will be during the general debates on diplomacy. And this will therefore have discussions, enable us to have discussions on the way in which we are going to progress in the future. I know that you all have a great sense of responsibility. I know that you have the same spirit of analysis and objectivity, desire to act. And here, once again, I think that all these talents and capacities are extremely important, particularly at this particular moment where our world is actually tipping into a completely new order. I've mentioned all of this because I think France and the world is going through a particularly tense moment. And I'd like to talk a little about the times that we are living through. I myself and many before me have probably always said that the times that we are going through are exceptional. This is necessarily always the case. However, I think as things stand today, this year is particularly exceptional. And I think there is something in the times that we are going through that I think indicate that there is real changes that are deep and which will have long-lasting orders. But I think it's also because there are major transformations taking place in Europe, which I don't think is something that's come out of the blue, but which are a continuation of several different phenomena which have been underlying our societies and our countries for many years. Let me share how I see things with you. As I said, first of all, this world that we're living in is actually full of heavy and deep phenomena. For some years now, our world has achieved a great deal on the one hand. For example, thanks to trade, the largest number of people have actually stepped out of poverty, thanks to innovation, thanks to her progress. For example, the fact that we invented a vaccine so quickly and managed to vaccinate so many people worldwide is in itself a sign of the great progress that our societies have made. There's also now the fact that our countries are much more interconnected. And this means that there's a sort of universal belief in our countries, a universal vision of the world at large. These are the sort of positive facts that I wanted to talk about. But let us not forget that there's the other side. And the other side is that there are many contradictions. For example, national and international stages are deeply intertwined. Everything we do has a global effect, and the global order is now fractured and is disintegrating faster than we can imagine. And that's what makes it all so difficult. And this is why the context today is extremely risky and fraught. When we have this interdependency, obviously I talked about innovation, the economies have changed many of our countries. Our societies are now open, our populations travel, move around, and we are connected globally. So we know what's going on everywhere at every moment. And this obviously does have a huge effect on our countries and on the established order. We have experienced this during the pandemic. Suddenly and overnight, everything went topsy-turvy, and our value chains were completely broken. And this is a perfect example of the effect of globalization. The result has made that almost 78 million inhabitants worldwide know poverty as well, and this was after the pandemic. Then there's the climate crisis. We have had experience of it firsthand in our own country this summer, but you see what's going on in Pakistan, in the Lake Chad area, and elsewhere. The IPCC has indicated that many of our ecosystems have already tipped over and have reached a point of non-return. And therefore, climate and our biodiversity, which affects everybody, is obviously going to have an effect on all our societies. And it is the source of migrations, which have already begun and will continue to be the main cause of migrations. It will also be the cause of the rebalancing of international phenomena. And also, I wanted to say that this obviously brings me to the third point, which is energy. And thanks to, or because of all these different crises, our sources of energy have become the main source of potential crises. For our countries and for others, we ourselves are experiencing this firsthand. Some countries are more affected than we are. But what is perfectly clear, that the sources of energy have created sources of dependency, and this has caused security risks. Once again, we can see that destabilization in the areas worldwide, which we are looking at closely, can be also a source of worry. For example, in the nuclear sector, if you could just see that the 10th conference for the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, which is, of course, a vital conference for establishing a balance concerning nuclear weapons and the proliferation of them worldwide, has just ended by a failure. And I think also there are terrorist risks which are are increasing in Africa and in the Levant, linked to climate crises. And then there's the demographic pressure, which is also going to have an effect on our geopolitics in the years to come. This is already the case in Europe. There has been a great deal of movements of individuals and populations in the east of Europe, but also these differences between our parts of the world and our continents are going to become even more acute. I've made a long list of all these different challenges, actually, because I wanted to say that this indicates once again how closely intertwined are our countries in dealing with all these issues and also in facing them. We cannot solve them or face them individually. We can only do so if there's a strong international order with shared goals. And this is the contradiction that I was talking about earlier on. Rarely in our contemporary years have the structures that existed in our different countries and in our world order been so cruelly shaken. And I think that we should look at this more closely and look at where we stand. The economic order, liberalism, capitalism, which was the force that governed many countries and which allowed many to step out of poverty, is now in a state of imbalance. And therefore, we can say that the situation is no longer the same in our country or in other parts of the world. It occurred initially during the first initial financial crisis, and when the unthought of actually occurred. And then it also continued while we were trying to solve that financial crisis. So there was a certain sense of injustice. It continued to create a imbalance in the way people perceived the effects of capitalism and liberalism on our economies. Then I talked about the climate and biodiversity crises, and these crises showed us that this model was no longer acceptable. It was not possible to allow all these different external factors that have an influence on the financial structures be managed by third parties. And then the third element, obviously, was the pandemic, which shook things up. Once again, the unthinkable occurred, everything closed down, and overnight, we found that we had to suddenly have become self-sufficient. This was no longer possible. Countries realized it was no longer possible. And countries realized that there were real weaknesses in the form of international trade that was prevailing at the time, because nothing was actually considered in any way to be particularly special or needed special protection. So I think that all of this has led to a large part of world production stepping away from its globalized model. And this, therefore, has shaken up the economic world order quite dramatically. Simultaneously, during that period, political liberalization was also being questioned. Perhaps they were, in a way, actually similar. Our societies had developed in the same way. For example, there was always based on free, open individuals and based on free and open trade and based on an opening up of the middle classes towards a better obtaining of wealth. But this, however, has changed. And the capacity that countries may have to impose these models as being the models that have to prevail and cannot be questioned no longer works. I think This is my modest experience based on the discussions that I've had with many heads of state and government. First of all, this form of order, economic order, has been shaken up in our own country. And also, you can see what's been happening around, what's been going on. You can see there are extremes everywhere. You see what happened to the capital last year, the storming of the capital, the fact that poverty has not been eradicated in many countries. And this is a major challenge for all of us because this is something that we have not achieved. And it is also something which challenges universalism of values. France was based on the values of the Enlightenment and has defended them. But today we have to realize that things are no longer the same and have the fractures in our societies have caused this particular weakness. And finally, there is also the fact that there is a rise of authoritarianism. Look at the case of Iran. I hope in the next few years the agreement will be reached with Iran, but we can see how difficult it is to handle these countries. And Russia, who is a permanent member of the Security Council, nuclear power, which has been violating all the rules that existed in the UN in a determined manner. It is quite clear that in the last years, using deterrence alone has not allowed us to withhold and to control these particular powers. And another aspect is that despite what's going on, we should keep in mind that our geopolitical world is leading to basically a competition between China and the United States. And this is a problem for us from many points of view. First of all, because it encourages China to redefine the international rules of the game. It has come up with its own narrative where its attitude and its behavior is established vis-à-vis its role with the United States. It is now coming up with values and principles that correspond to that posture. And therefore, there seems to be a competition for universalism. China is trying to establish an international order which will be in direct competition with the order that Washington upheld up to not so long ago. And this obviously means that international orders are being made more fragile. But, and I think this is where perhaps our country and French diplomacy comes into its own. We ourselves have never found ourselves in a state of subservience. We have partners. We have, obviously, we shared values with the United States, but we have always maintained our independence. The threat that we are going through right now is that we are being obliged to choose a camp. And this competition is necessarily going to weaken international initiatives. We've seen this actually at work within the WHO during the COVID crisis. So all this brings me to say, and of course this is just part of the picture, there's much more that we can say, but the fact that the international order has to face these issues and take action jointly is become more difficult. And to be able to solve some of these problems that are our problems, but also the problems for our planet, we've got to actually have greater cooperation. And the cooperation obviously is, in any case, jeopardized because of this fragility that I spoke about. The fact that we now have war close to our borders complicates matters further, and therefore has led our continent and the international order to be shaken up. The invasion of Ukraine has direct influence on our own security. It actually is aiming at the principles that we had from ever, at least since the end of World War II, which is the question of the integrity of our borders and issues that we have held close to our hearts based on the United Nations principles. And it is therefore destroying the very principles that we had at our base. Because of the nature of the war and its consequences or potential consequences on energy, on food, on immigration, on information, will have a huge impact in our countries. We see this already in public opinion and the reaction of our populations. And this is why we are doing our best to make sure that it doesn't spread any further. But it is a hybrid war as well. It's given the techniques that are used by Russia, for example, the approach of attacking Ukraine through Belarus is in itself, I think, a way of using hybrid forms. And so in this way has already made it into a world conflict. As a result, we are facing a war also of rhetoric, of narratives, and of the discourse. Russia wants to actually sap the principles of universalism, the major principles that have been weakened. Well, now what Russia is doing is trying to fight rationality. It is trying to change the questions of guilt concerning NATO, and it is, in a way, legitimizing its own intervention. And therefore, what it is doing is reinforcing this weakening of the international order that I talked about, and obviously has a huge effect on our democracies. And it also adds to a risk of further deflagration, and also to make all the different individual fractures that I spoke about set forever. It also defines the North-South issues and has led to a further divide between the North and South. We have seen that there is a real doubt concerning consensus that we had talked about earlier on. More than 1.7 billion people have been affected as a result of these divides by the increase in food prices and energy prices. So this war, by taking further strength, will actually lead to a further destruction. There's a summa divisio between our countries, and this is gradually going to reinforce the competition between the United States and China.
And to establish a rebalance, an international system which is really not in our interest and that we need to prevent. And forces are actually in play, and the tensions in the Strait of Taiwan means that the situation is serious. So this is a reality. We have a war of annexation at our door, led by a power which is a member of the Security Council, supported by a hybrid war which is being waged at the global level, and a deconstruction of historic frameworks. It's a change, a deep change for our country, for our diplomacy. We thought we could draw the dividends of peace, but this time is over. We need to defend it and to rebuild it. The time we thought that we could enjoy our freedom without paying the price is over. We have to cherish our freedom, our values, and we need also to defend them. We have to fight for them, and we have to accept all the consequences it entails when others are fighting on our behalf for such a freedom. This is what is happening now in Ukraine. At a time when the international order defined after the Second World War and consolidated after the Cold War is now challenged, and we have to rebuild it. So this is the situation we have today, and it should not lead to pessimism or to despair. It's a huge challenge, and we need a diplomacy of combat, several combats, and define clearly some principles and objectives to avoid the gravitational movement continues and the war being extended, and accelerate the phenomena that are in play and the international disorder. This is the challenge today for France and its diplomacy. Now, in a really practical manner, and I think that when situations are complicated, we have to explain them simply. I'd like to explain the different ways to build this diplomacy and to set three objectives. They're not comprehensive, of course. We have some basic facts. We have to respect the sovereignty of each state and its territorial integrity. It's important. It's the best argument we have today vis-à-vis Russia. Sometimes the Western world accepted doubts on such issues on the basis of our values, and sometimes we have documented what others are reproaching us. It's invariable. You cannot actually replace peoples and build coalitions to force them to change their leaders, to exert pressure through the world. We can look at the mechanisms appropriate to do that. We can have regional coalitions, several players. We can together re-evaluate our sanctions, and the results we will see in the next few months or years. But the sovereignty of people and the territorial integrity of states is incontrovertible. The second thing in this complex world is that we have to be able to speak to everybody. Now, if diplomacy was the art of speaking with people who agree with us, I would not present the ambition that I presented earlier on for our network, because we would need less positions and means. We have to accept it. We would actually be in a situation where we will have no power. Who would like Turkey to be the only country member of NATO to speak to Russia? And tomorrow people will say, well, Turkey is strong. France is incapable of building a peace. So the profession of a diplomat is to speak to everybody, including people we do not agree with. So we will continue to do so. And we will use a simple grammar. We have coalitions, we have allies, we are defending consistency with our allies, we are allies within the NATO, we have decided on sanctions, and there are some members who are trading with Russia, and this is not being said out loud, and I want to actually remind it. We are consistent, we have alliances, but we must defend freedom in action and dialogue vis-à-vis Russia. And we also need more and more. And I think this is an asset. It's in our DNA to build more and more balanced partnerships on an equal footing. The major structures with a supervising power trying to make others subservient, it doesn't work. We need bilateral and regional partnerships, redefine finding equilibriums with the different grammar, where sport, culture, even the gastronomy, the soft power, these are key elements in our capacity to act usefully and to supplement our different actions. These are the incontrovertible facts, and I'd like to remind them here so that it's clear for everybody. There are three objectives, simple objectives, and they are within the framework of our actions, because what we've done over the past years was not actually orthogonal vis-à-vis what is occurring. The first objective of our diplomacy is to defend the strength, influence of France. And the first principle is the one to follow. If there are not others, it's consistent, and it brings together the national and international objective, because there is no strong diplomacy without strong economy. I mentioned the army. Here, they look at your economy, they look at your army, and we ended a long period of disindustrialization. And I'm proud that we are first in the area of startup development, and diplomacy should actually support this agenda, because the stronger the country is from the economic point of view, the more we will have the capacity to develop our strength and to have greater influence. So I'd like to hail the work that has been done by all the operators, by the whole network. I like consistency in the field. In the field, we have the ambassadors who are actually driving our work. It's a single France everywhere. You have cultural advisors, you have Business France, AFD. These are all in support of the same thing. Let me close the parenthesis here. And there is a lot of work that was done. We want to also work to increase our attractiveness, and we will continue with Choose France initiatives, and we will work on our cultural strength and also on our strength in the area of gastronomy. So it's not actually putting things in silos. Major great companies are looking for experience, and France has great value in this area. And there is the beauty of France, attractiveness of France. All this works together. It's a good thing to organize events in Versailles, to speak about culture, to have all those who are supporting our cultural projects to explain our reforms. This is a comparative advantage of France as compared to others. And I think that within 10 years, it will work more than isolated stations run Paris. So I think this is clear. This is a clear agenda, and I would like to praise all those who worked, and I would like them to continue working harder. And on the gastronomy diplomacy, developing our tourism, this is also key. And the role of Business France, Active France, and the work that is being done. So it's not a minor mission. It is in synergy with the rest. And I would like us to be able to continue developing our external trade service. And I would like to speak about two aspects. I'm surprised, and the delegations of presidents is something that I've noticed. The same people are in the delegations, and they're not actually the members of the delegations are not those who need me more to set foot in a country. So reorganizing the timing of our agendas. We need to support more than we have done SMEs at the international level. This is where we'll make the difference. And what we were able to do with the Business France, Public Investment Bank, and we changed the life of an SME life when they travel with the delegation more than for a major company. So we need to multiply this support strategy. It actually shows clearly in a strong manner the support that the network can bring, and also your greatest ambassadors. And I would like to also align France 2030 with our external trade strategy, transforming our creative, industrial, agricultural network. We have to support the priorities of France 2030. This is where we can find the right stakeholders and partners, and to better serve some SMEs, creative, cultural industries. They are key elements in this area. And lastly, contribution to make France stronger and to increase its influence. It's accepting this strategy to increase France's influence. Some people don't like this word, but I think it is important to recognize it, to explain what we are, explaining that it's not only about imbalance relationship, but explaining what is the core of our strategy. It makes France stronger and it makes it easier for the rest of the world to understand France, and it increases our influence. Now, so much for the external strategy. And I'd like to speak about school and education and the reform that we made, and I'd like to pay tribute to that. It made it possible. Of course, it created difficulties. We accepted what was a reality in the field, but it made it possible to create a real fabric in order to increase the schooling for our children, even abroad. We have to improve the geographical distribution, but sometimes to school, other children who want to have access to a French education and to learn French. So we have to improve this strategy, as I want to also increase cooperation with universities in key countries for us. Then we have culture. I'll mention it rapidly, but the network has a key role to play with the French Institute, and there are different agents being mobilized to develop cultural projects everywhere in the world, and I'd like to acknowledge that. I want to give a new impetus to that. We've done it, and I've seen it's important in several countries I visited recently in Africa, but I want it to be based on the philosophy of partnership on an equal footing, and also explaining the risks that we have taken collectively, the change in philosophy that France brought in the restitution of works of art. This is really important in the terms of cultural partnership with Benin. The Abomey treasures, the 26 Abomey treasures were returned, and this was justice, consistency from the scientific and cultural point of view in the making, and that is what we need to deploy everywhere, because it changes the way people perceive France, countries and youth abroad perceive France. So on creative and cultural industries, on heritage, we need to develop more initiatives, and we have to use partnerships forms that we can that we can build on. That was done several years ago with ALIF under the presidency of François Hollande. This was a great capacity for France to intervene in the areas of crisis and war, to have this cultural and scientific influence. And in the area of heritage, this is what we are doing. Now, the epicenter were the countries of Africa in the Congo Basin, more particularly. But we actually played a role of providing support for translating.
And we've been listening there to French President Emmanuel Macron addressing the Conference of Ambassadors here in Paris at the Élysée Palace.